Here is something almost no one tells you about the 4th of July. You probably know the story. A group of brave colonists, fed up with British tyranny, declared their independence on a warm summer day in Philadelphia. Church bells rang. Crowds cheered. A new nation was born. It is a clean story, a satisfying story, and in many important ways it is incomplete. The real story of American independence is messier, stranger, and far more fascinating than the version most of us learned. It involves a revolution that almost did not happen, a declaration that was already obsolete by the time it was signed, a war that could have been lost a dozen different times, and a cast of characters who were deeply, sometimes fatally, divided among themselves. Some of them were heroes, some were hypocrites. Some were both at the same time. And here is the thing that should stop you cold. On July 4th, 1776, most of the men whose names appear on the Declaration of Independence did not actually sign it that day. The war had already been going on for over a year, and the man most responsible for writing the document owned more than 100 human beings as slaves while writing the words, "All men are created equal." So what actually happened? What was 1776 really about? Who made it happen? Who tried to stop it? And what did it cost? And why does the gap between the legend and the reality matter so much? That is what this video is about. Not to tear down the story, but to make it real. Because the real story is more compelling, more human, and more important than the myth. Let us go back to the beginning. Not 1776. Earlier. Much earlier. To understand why the American Revolution happened, you have to understand what the British Empire looked like in the middle of the 18th century. By the 1750s, Britain was one of the most powerful empires on earth. It controlled vast stretches of the Caribbean, significant portions of India, trading posts along the African coast, and 13 colonies strung along the eastern seaboard of North America. These colonies were, by the standards of the time, remarkably prosperous. They were also remarkably self-governing. This is the first thing most people miss. The American colonists were not living under a brutal, grinding tyranny in the way that, say, Irish peasants or Indian subjects of the East India Company were. They had their own legislatures. They had their own courts. They ran their own local affairs with a degree of autonomy that was genuinely unusual for the 18th century. A man in Massachusetts or Virginia had far more say in his own governance than most people anywhere in the world at that time. But they were still part of the British Empire. And the British Empire, after 1763, had a serious problem. That problem was debt. The 7 Years' War, which Americans know mostly through its North American chapter, the French and Indian War, had been a global conflict of extraordinary scale. Britain had fought France and Spain across 4 continents. It had won, spectacularly. By the Treaty of Paris in 1763, Britain gained Canada, Florida, and dominance over India. It was the greatest imperial triumph of the century. It had also nearly bankrupted the British government. The national debt had roughly doubled during the war, and a significant portion of that war, from the British perspective, had been fought to protect the American colonies from French encroachment. So the British government, under King George III and a succession of ministers, arrived at what seemed to them like a perfectly logical conclusion. The colonists should help pay for their own defense. This is where things started to go wrong, not because the idea was inherently unreasonable, but because of how it was implemented, and because of how deeply it collided with something the colonists had come to regard as a fundamental right. The phrase you need to know is "no taxation without representation." It sounds like a slogan, and it became one, but it expressed something that colonists genuinely believed with great intensity. The British constitutional tradition, which the colonists considered their inheritance as British subjects, held that a man could not be taxed without his consent, and that consent had to be given through elected representatives. The colonists had no representatives in the British Parliament. Therefore, Parliament had no right to tax them. The British government disagreed. Parliament, in the British view, represented the entire empire through a concept called virtual representation. Every member of Parliament, in theory, represented not just his own constituents but all British subjects everywhere. The colonists were virtually represented even if they had no actual vote. The colonists thought this was, to put it diplomatically, nonsense. And so began a decade of escalating conflict that would end in revolution. But it did not feel like revolution at first. It felt like a constitutional argument between people who all considered themselves British subjects. The Stamp Act of 1765 was the first major flashpoint. It imposed a direct tax on paper goods, legal documents, newspapers, pamphlets, even playing cards, requiring them to bear a revenue stamp. It was not a heavy tax by later standards. But the principle it represented was explosive. Protests erupted across the colonies. A group calling itself the Sons of Liberty organized boycotts and, in some cases, intimidated stamp collectors into resigning. The British government, surprised by the ferocity of the response, repealed the Stamp Act in 1766. But here is the crucial detail. They repealed it while simultaneously passing the Declaratory Act, which stated flatly that Parliament had the right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. They backed down on the specific tax while doubling down on the principle. It was the worst possible combination. It taught the colonists that resistance worked while teaching the British that they had to hold the line on parliamentary supremacy. The Townshend Acts of 1767 imposed new taxes on imported goods: glass, paint, paper, tea. More protests, more boycotts. In 1770, British soldiers stationed in Boston, resented by locals who saw them as an occupying force, fired into a crowd during a confrontation, killing 5 people. Colonial newspapers called it a massacre. The British called it self-defense. The truth, as usual, was somewhere in between. But the story of the Boston Massacre, as shaped by men like Paul Revere, whose famous engraving depicted the soldiers firing in cold blood on an innocent crowd, became one of the most powerful pieces of political propaganda in American history. The Townshend duties were mostly repealed, but the tax on tea remained, again, as a matter of principle. And then came 1773, and the Boston Tea Party, and everything accelerated. The Tea Act of 1773 was actually designed to help the colonists in a narrow economic sense. It gave the East India Company the right to sell tea directly to the colonies, cutting out middlemen and making tea cheaper than it had been before. But it also gave the company a monopoly, and it still carried the hated tax. And so, on the night of December 16, 1773, a group of colonists disguised, somewhat theatrically, as Mohawk Indians boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. The value of that tea in today's terms was somewhere around $1 million. The British government's response was swift and severe. The Coercive Acts of 1774, which the colonists immediately renamed the Intolerable Acts, closed Boston Harbor until the tea was paid for, restructured the Massachusetts government to reduce its self-governing powers, and required colonists to house British soldiers on demand. These measures were meant to isolate Massachusetts and punish it into submission. Instead, they united the colonies. The First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia in September 1744. Delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered to coordinate their response. They agreed to a sweeping boycott of British goods. They petitioned the king, and they agreed to meet again if things did not improve. Things did not improve. On April 19, 1775, British troops marched out of Boston toward the town of Concord, where colonial militias had been stockpiling weapons. They were met at Lexington by a small group of minute men. Shots were fired. No one, to this day, is entirely certain who fired first. 8 colonists were killed. The British marched on to Concord, where they were driven back by a larger force of militia. By the time the British column returned to Boston, it had suffered nearly 300 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing. The American Revolution had begun. But here is the thing. Almost no one called it a revolution yet. Almost no one was calling for independence. The colonists who took up arms in April 1775 were, in the vast majority, fighting for their rights as British subjects, not to break free from Britain entirely. This is one of the most important and least understood facts about the American Revolution. Independence was not the goal at the beginning. It was the conclusion that a significant number of people arrived at slowly, reluctantly, and after a great deal of argument. The Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia in May 1775, just weeks after Lexington and Concord. The war was already underway. The delegates had to manage it. They created the Continental Army and appointed George Washington as its commander-in-chief. They organized finances. They tried to coordinate 13 very different colonies with very different interests. And they argued constantly about what they were actually fighting for. There were men in that Congress who still hoped for reconciliation with Britain. John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, one of the most respected political thinkers in the colonies, drafted the Olive Branch Petition, a final appeal to King George III, asking him to intervene and resolve the conflict. It was adopted by Congress in July 1775 and sent to London. King George refused to read it.
He declared the colonies to be in a state of rebellion and hired Hessian mercenaries, German soldiers, to help suppress it. That decision changed everything. It was, in retrospect, one of the most consequential political miscalculations in British history, because it removed the last realistic hope for reconciliation and pushed moderate colonists toward the independence camp. But even then, independence was not inevitable. It had to be argued for, persuaded for, and fought for, politically, not just militarily. Enter Thomas Paine. Paine was not an American. He was an Englishman who had arrived in Philadelphia in late 1774, carrying a letter of introduction from Benjamin Franklin. He had failed at almost everything he had tried in England: excise officer, corset maker, shopkeeper. He was 37 years old, obscure, and broke. In January 1776, he published a pamphlet called Common Sense. What Paine did in Common Sense was something that no one had done quite so directly before. He made the case for independence not as a legal argument, not as a constitutional claim, but as a moral and practical necessity. He attacked the very idea of monarchy as absurd and corrupt. He argued that America had an opportunity and a responsibility to create something entirely new in the world. And he wrote in language that ordinary people could understand and respond to. "We have it in our power to begin the world over again," he wrote. It is one of the most electrifying sentences in the political literature of the 18th century. Common Sense sold somewhere between 100,000 and 500,000 copies in the first few months, in a country with a population of roughly 2.5 million. To put that in perspective, it would be the equivalent of a book selling tens of millions of copies today. It was read aloud in taverns and town squares. It was passed from hand to hand. It shifted public opinion in a way that no political speech or congressional resolution had managed to do. Paine did not cause the revolution, but he gave it a language and a moral framework at exactly the moment when the movement needed one. By the spring of 1776, the momentum toward independence was building rapidly. Several colonies had already instructed their delegates to support it. Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a formal resolution in Congress on June 7, 1776, declaring that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. Congress did not vote on it immediately. They needed time to bring the reluctant colonies, particularly Pennsylvania, New York, and South Carolina, along. They appointed a committee to draft a formal declaration in case the vote succeeded. That committee included Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, and a 33-year-old Virginia lawyer named Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was chosen to write the first draft. Adams later claimed that he had urged Jefferson to take the task, saying that Jefferson was a better writer. Jefferson was also from Virginia, the largest colony, and his authorship would signal that this was not merely a New England project. Jefferson wrote quickly. He worked in his rented rooms on the second floor of a house on Market Street in Philadelphia. He had no books with him, or so he later claimed. He was drawing on what he already knew, already believed, already felt. He produced a draft in about 2 weeks. The famous preamble, the part that begins, "We hold these truths to be self-evident," was not entirely original. Jefferson drew heavily on the political philosophy of John Locke, the English philosopher who had argued that all people possessed natural rights to life, liberty, and property. Jefferson changed property to the pursuit of happiness, a phrase with a long intellectual history that he transformed into something memorable. He also drew on George Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights, which had been adopted just weeks earlier and contained remarkably similar language. This is not a criticism. Jefferson was synthesizing the best political thinking of his era and expressing it with extraordinary clarity and power. The genius was not in inventing new ideas, but in finding words that made those ideas feel inevitable and true. The draft went to the committee, which made some changes. Then it went to Congress, which made many more changes. Jefferson sat and suffered through the editing process, which Adams later said was painful to watch. Congress cut roughly a quarter of the original text. The most significant cut was a passage attacking King George for allowing and encouraging the slave trade. Jefferson, who enslaved people himself, had written a condemnation of slavery into the founding document of the nation. Congress, under pressure from South Carolina and Georgia, and with the silent complicity of many northern delegates whose merchants had profited from the slave trade, removed it entirely. This is one of the great, agonizing ironies of American history, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. Jefferson wrote, "All men are created equal," while enslaving more than 100 people at his plantation in Virginia. He knew the contradiction. He wrote about it. He expressed what appears to have been genuine moral anguish about it, at least in private, and he did nothing to resolve it. He freed only a handful of enslaved people in his lifetime, and most of those were members of his own family through his relationship with Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman who could not legally consent to that relationship. The founding generation's failure to address slavery was not an oversight. It was a choice, a deliberate, agonizing, consequential choice made by men who understood exactly what they were doing and chose to defer the reckoning to future generations. Those future generations paid for that choice in blood in the Civil War that killed more Americans than any other conflict in history. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Back to Philadelphia. Back to 1776. On July 2, 1776, the Continental Congress voted on Richard Henry Lee's resolution for independence. 12 colonies voted in favor. New York abstained. Their delegates had not yet received instructions to vote for independence. No colony voted against. John Adams wrote to his wife Abigail that day, "The 2nd day of July, 1776, will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America." He was wrong about the date. History, as it often does, had other plans. Congress spent the next 2 days debating and editing the text of the Declaration. On July 4th, they approved the final text. The Declaration of Independence was adopted. But here is the thing that surprises most people. Most of the delegates did not sign it that day. The document was sent to a printer named John Dunlap, who produced several hundred copies overnight, the famous Dunlap broadsides, which were distributed to colonial assemblies, military commanders, and newspapers. Washington had it read aloud to his troops in New York on July 9th. It was read in town squares and meeting houses across the colonies. The formal signing, the one depicted in John Trumbull's famous painting, the image that most of us carry in our heads when we think of the Declaration, happened on August 2nd, 1776. Most of the delegates signed then. A few signed later. One, Thomas McKean of Delaware, may not have signed until 1781. The painting itself, which hangs in the Capitol Rotunda in Washington and has appeared on the back of the $2 bill, is not a depiction of July 4th. It is not even entirely accurate. Some of the men depicted were not present on August 2nd, and some who were present are not in the painting. It is a symbolic image, not a documentary one. But it became the image, the mental picture that fixed the story in the popular imagination. Here is another thing the legend tends to skip over. In July 1776, independence was genuinely controversial. A significant portion of the colonial population, estimates range from 20 to 30%, though the true figure is impossible to know, remained loyal to the British Crown. These loyalists, or Tories as their opponents called them, were not simply confused or cowardly. Many of them had principled reasons for their position. They believed in the British constitutional system. They feared that independence would lead to mob rule. They worried about what would happen to their property, their businesses, their communities. The revolution was also, in many places, a civil war. Loyalist and patriot neighbors turned against each other. Families were divided. In some regions, particularly in the South and in frontier areas, the fighting between loyalist and patriot militias was as brutal as anything involving the British regular army. And then there were the people whose voices are almost entirely absent from the traditional telling of this story. Enslaved people, who made up roughly 20% of the colonial population, had their own complex relationship to the revolution. Some fought with the Continental Army, drawn by promises of freedom. Others, perhaps more, sided with the British, because the British had offered something the Patriots had not. Lord Dunmore, the Royal Governor of Virginia, issued a proclamation in November 1775 offering freedom to enslaved people who escaped their Patriot masters and joined the British forces. Thousands did. They made a rational calculation about who was more likely to offer them liberty, and they concluded it was not the men writing about liberty in Philadelphia. Indigenous nations faced a similarly impossible situation. Most of the major confederacies, the Iroquois, the Cherokee, the Creek, tried initially to remain neutral, recognizing that the conflict between British and colonists was not their war. When neutrality became impossible, most ultimately sided with the British, again for rational reasons. The British had the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which had forbidden colonial settlement west of the Appalachians, offering at least nominal protection to indigenous lands. The Patriots, by contrast, wanted to expand westward. The indigenous peoples who read the situation clearly understood that a patriot victory would mean the end of that protection and the opening of their lands to settlement. They were right. This is not to say that the revolution was simply a story of oppression. It was also, genuinely, one of the most remarkable political experiments in human history. The ideas expressed in the Declaration of Independence, that all people possess inherent rights, that governments derive their legitimacy from the consent of the governed, that it is legitimate to overthrow a government that fails to protect those rights, were radical in 1776. They were not invented by the founders, but the founders gave them a political expression and institutional form that would reverberate around the world for centuries. The French Revolution drew on American ideas and American example. Simón Bolívar and the liberators of Latin America drew on them. The revolutionaries of 1848 in Europe drew on them. The anti-colonial movements of the 20th century drew on them. The language of the Declaration of Independence has been invoked by people seeking freedom from oppression in nearly every corner of the world, often by people the founders would not have considered fully human. That is the paradox at the heart of 1776. The founders created something larger than themselves, something that escaped their intentions and their limitations, something that became a standard by which their own failures could be measured and condemned. But none of that was visible in the summer of 1776. What was visible in the summer of 1776 was the war, and the war was going badly. Washington had been trying to hold New York City with an army that was, by professional military standards, barely an army at all. His men were poorly trained, poorly equipped, and poorly paid when they were paid at all. Many enlisted for short terms and went home when those terms expired, regardless of military necessity. Disease ravaged the camps. Desertion was a constant problem. In late August 1776, the British launched a massive assault on Long Island. They had roughly 32,000 troops, one of the largest expeditionary forces Britain had ever assembled. Washington had perhaps 19,000 men, many of them militia with little combat experience. The Battle of Long Island was a disaster for the Americans. The British outflanked Washington's position and inflicted heavy casualties. Washington managed to evacuate his army across the East River to Manhattan in a nighttime operation, one of the more impressive logistical feats of the war, but he had been badly beaten. Over the following months, the British drove the Continental Army out of New York, through New Jersey, and across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. By December 1776, the situation looked desperate. Washington's army had shrunk to fewer than 3,000 effective troops. Enlistments were expiring at the end of the year. Thomas Paine, now traveling with the army, wrote the opening lines of a new pamphlet. "These are the times that try men's souls." He was not exaggerating. And then came Christmas night, 1776. Washington decided to cross the Delaware River and attack the Hessian garrison at Trenton, New Jersey. The crossing was brutal. Chunks of ice in the river, a winter storm, men without adequate shoes or clothing. They made it across. They marched through the night. And in the early morning of December 26th, they struck the Hessian garrison at Trenton. The battle lasted less than an hour. The Americans captured nearly 1,000 prisoners and suffered almost no casualties of their own. It was not a strategically decisive battle, but it was psychologically transformative. It proved that the Continental Army could fight and win. It renewed enlistments. It kept the revolution alive. A week later, Washington won again at Princeton. The tide had not turned. The war would go on for 5 more years, but the crisis of December 1776 had passed. The story of how the war was actually won is long and complex, and it deserves its own video. But a few points are essential to understanding what 1776 really meant. The Continental Army, for all its struggles, never collapsed entirely. Washington's great achievement as a commander was not tactical brilliance. He lost more battles than he won, but strategic endurance. He understood that his primary goal was to keep an army in the field, to deny the British a decisive victory, to make the war expensive and prolonged enough that the British public and the British Parliament would eventually lose the will to continue it. It was, in modern terms, a strategy of exhaustion. The French intervention, which began in earnest after the American victory at Saratoga in October 1777, was decisive. France had been waiting for evidence that the Americans could actually fight. Saratoga provided it. France entered the war as an American ally in 1778, bringing naval power, troops, money, and, Crucially, the threat of a wider European war that stretched British resources to the breaking point. Without French support, it is genuinely difficult to see how the Americans could have won. The final act came at Yorktown, Virginia in October 1781. A combined American and French army, with French naval support cutting off British escape by sea, trapped the main British army in North America under General Cornwallis. After a siege of several weeks, Cornwallis surrendered. When his troops marched out to lay down their arms, the British band reportedly played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." It was an appropriate choice. The Treaty of Paris, signed in September 1783, formally ended the war and recognized American independence. Britain ceded all territory east of the Mississippi River to the new United States. It was an extraordinarily generous settlement, far more so than the Americans had any military right to expect, the result of skillful diplomacy by Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, who played the European powers against each other with considerable finesse. But independence, it turned out, was the easy part. The 13 newly independent states had declared themselves free from British rule. They had not yet figured out how to govern themselves. The Articles of Confederation, which had served as the framework for the wartime government, gave the central government almost no real power. It could not tax. It could not regulate commerce. It could not enforce its own decisions. The states behaved, in many respects, like 13 separate countries. The crisis came to a head in 1786 and 1787. Shays' Rebellion, an armed uprising of indebted farmers in Massachusetts, who felt that the new state government was as oppressive as the British had been, shocked the political elite into action. If the new republic could not maintain order, what was the point of independence? The Constitutional Convention of 1787 produced the document that actually governs the United States today. It was a remarkable achievement and a deeply contested one. The debates in Philadelphia that summer were sharp, sometimes bitter, and full of compromises that would have enormous consequences. The 3/5 compromise, which counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for purposes of congressional representation, giving slaveholding states more political power while treating the enslaved as less than human, was one of the most consequential and morally troubling of those compromises. The Constitution was ratified in 1788. George Washington was unanimously elected as the first president in 1789. The United States of America, as a functioning constitutional republic, was up and running. And yet the story was not over. It never is. The revolution created a set of ideals that the new nation immediately began failing to live up to. The contradiction between all men are created equal and the reality of slavery was not resolved. It was managed, deferred, papered over with compromises that became increasingly unstable. The rights proclaimed in the Declaration applied, in practice, to white men with property. Women had no political rights. Indigenous peoples were being pushed off their lands. Free black Americans in the North faced systematic discrimination. None of this makes the revolution meaningless. But it does mean that the revolution was not a completed event. It was the beginning of an argument about who the ideals applied to, who counted as fully human, whose rights deserved protection. That argument continued through the abolitionist movement, through the Civil War and Reconstruction, through the women's suffrage movement, through the civil rights movement of the 20th century, and it continues today. Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist and escaped slave, gave one of the most powerful speeches in American history on July 5, 1852, deliberately one day after Independence Day. He asked his audience, "What, to the American slave, is your 4th of July?" His answer was devastating. The 4th of July, he said, was a day that revealed the hypocrisy of a nation that celebrated liberty while holding millions in bondage. But he did not give up on the founding ideals. He argued that the Constitution, properly interpreted, was an anti-slavery document. He believed that the promise of 1776 could be redeemed, but only through struggle, not through celebration. That is perhaps the most honest way to think about 1776, not as a completed achievement, but as a promissory note, to use the phrase that Martin Luther King Jr. would use more than a century later. A promise that America made to itself and to the world, a promise that it has spent more than 2 centuries trying, imperfectly and incompletely, to keep. Now let us talk about some of the things you probably did not know about 1776. The details that the textbooks tend to leave out. The Declaration of Independence was almost not written by Jefferson. John Adams was originally asked to write the first draft. He declined, giving several reasons, including that he was too well known as an advocate for independence and that a Virginian's authorship would be more politically effective. But there is also a story, which Adams told in his old age and which Jefferson disputed, that Adams told Jefferson he was simply a better writer. Whether or not that exchange happened exactly as Adams remembered it, Jefferson did write the draft, and the result speaks for itself. Benjamin Franklin, who made relatively few changes to Jefferson's draft, did make one that Jefferson always remembered. Jefferson had written that certain truths were sacred and undeniable. Franklin changed it to self-evident. It is a small change with enormous philosophical implications. Sacred and undeniable suggests truths that are revealed, perhaps by God. Self-evident suggests truths that are accessible to reason alone, a more secular, Enlightenment framing. Franklin's edit in 2 words shifted the philosophical foundation of the document. The Liberty Bell, the iconic symbol of American independence, did not actually ring on July 4, 1776. The story that it rang to celebrate independence appears to have been invented in the 19th century. The bell, which hung in the Pennsylvania State House, now Independence Hall, was certainly rung on various occasions during the Revolutionary period. But the specific story of it ringing on July 4th cannot be verified from contemporary sources. The bell's famous crack also did not happen in 1776. It cracked sometime in the early 19th century, possibly during a ringing to celebrate George Washington's birthday in 1846. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson both died on July 4, 1826, exactly 50 years after the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. Adams's last words were reportedly, "Thomas Jefferson survives." He was wrong. Jefferson had died a few hours earlier. The coincidence was so remarkable that many Americans at the time took it as a sign of divine providence, that the 2 great founders had been preserved long enough to see the 50th anniversary of the nation they had helped create. James Monroe, the 5th president, also died on July 4, 1831. 3 of the first 5 presidents died on Independence Day. Make of that what you will. The Declaration of Independence almost did not survive. During the War of 1812, when British troops burned Washington, a State Department clerk named Stephen Pleasanton loaded the original document into linen bags and evacuated it to a farmhouse in Virginia. Without that quick thinking, the physical document might have been destroyed. The original declaration, which you can see today at the National Archives in Washington, is badly faded, partly because, in the 19th century, before anyone understood the importance of preservation, it was frequently exhibited in direct sunlight and even subjected to a wet transfer process that removed much of the ink. George Washington, the indispensable man of the Revolution, was not the obvious choice for commander-in-chief. He had significant military experience from the French and Indian War, but his record was mixed. He had been involved in the incident that sparked that war, a skirmish in 1754 in which his forces killed a French diplomat, an act that some historians have argued helped trigger a global conflict. He had also suffered a humiliating defeat at Fort Necessity shortly afterward. His selection as Continental Army commander was as much political as military. He was a Virginian, which was essential for Southern support. He was wealthy and therefore presumably not motivated by personal gain, and he projected an air of calm authority that Congress found reassuring. What made Washington great was not his battlefield tactics. It was his character, his judgment, and above all his decision, at the end of the war, to give up power. When some officers suggested that he should become king, he refused, firmly and publicly. When he resigned his military commission in 1783 and returned to his farm at Mount Vernon, he astonished the world. King George III, when told that Washington planned to give up power and return to private life, reportedly said, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." Washington did that. His willingness to relinquish power was not just personally admirable, it was constitutionally essential. It established the precedent that in America, military commanders were subordinate to civilian authority, and that political power did not belong to individuals but to the people. It is a precedent that has been tested many times in American history and has so far held. The question of what the revolution actually changed, and for whom, is one that historians have debated for generations. For white men with property, it was transformative. The Republican ideals of the revolution genuinely expanded political participation over time, eroded the deference that ordinary people had previously shown to social elites, and created a political culture that was more egalitarian than anything that had existed in the colonies before.
Alexis de Tocqueville, the French observer who visited America in the 1830s, was struck by the remarkable equality of social manners, the way that Americans of different economic classes interacted without the elaborate hierarchies of deference that characterized European society.
For women, the revolution created some new spaces for political engagement. Women participated in boycotts, ran farms and businesses while their husbands were away at war, and in some states briefly had the right to vote before that right was taken away. Abigail Adams wrote to her husband John in March 1776, asking him to remember the ladies when framing new laws and warning that women would not be bound by laws in which they had no voice. John Adams's response was dismissive. It would take 144 years until 1920 for women to gain the constitutional right to vote nationwide. For enslaved people, the revolution was, in the immediate term, largely a catastrophe. The ideology of liberty did lead some northern states to abolish slavery in the years after independence, Vermont in 1777, Massachusetts through court decisions in the early 1780s, Pennsylvania through a gradual emancipation law in 1780. But in the South, slavery became more entrenched, not less. The cotton gin, invented in 1793, would make slavery vastly more profitable in the following decades. The number of enslaved people in the United States grew from roughly 500,000 at independence to nearly 4 million by the time of the Civil War. For indigenous peoples, the revolution was unambiguously catastrophic. The removal of British restraints on westward expansion opened the floodgates. The decades following independence saw wave after wave of dispossession, broken treaties, and forced removal. The Trail of Tears, the Wars of the Plains, the systematic destruction of indigenous cultures and communities, all of this followed directly from the revolution's removal of the one imperial power that had, however imperfectly and self-interestedly, placed any limits on colonial expansion. These are not comfortable facts, but they are real ones. And a history that leaves them out is not just incomplete, it is dishonest. Here is what I think is the most important thing to understand about 1776, the thing that makes it genuinely worth studying and genuinely worth arguing about. The American Revolution was not a finished event, it was a beginning. It established a set of principles about human equality, about the source of political legitimacy, about the rights of individuals against the power of the state that were radical in their time and remain contested today. It created institutions, a constitutional republic, a system of checks and balances, an independent judiciary, a free press that were imperfect from the start but have shown remarkable durability over more than 2 centuries. And it planted a contradiction at the heart of American life. Between the universal ideals of the Declaration and the particular realities of who those ideals actually applied to, that has driven American history ever since. Every major reform movement in American history has been, in some sense, an argument about whether the promise of 1776 applies to more people than the founders intended. The abolitionists, the suffragists, the labor movement, the civil rights movement, all of them invoked the Declaration of Independence. All of them argued that the founders' principles demanded more than the founders themselves were willing to deliver. That is the real story of 1776. Not a clean triumph, not a simple founding myth, but a complex, contradictory, genuinely revolutionary moment that set in motion forces that are still playing out today. A group of flawed, brilliant, courageous, hypocritical, visionary human beings made a bet on a set of ideas, and the consequences of that bet are still unfolding. The fireworks and the flags and the speeches are not wrong to celebrate. But they celebrate most honestly when they acknowledge what was promised, what was delivered, and what work remains. John Adams, in that same letter to Abigail in which he predicted that July 2nd would be the most memorable date in American history, wrote something else. He wrote that the anniversary of independence ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward forevermore. He got that right. The celebration is appropriate. The revolution was real. The achievement was genuine. But Adams also knew, better than most, how much had been left undone. He had argued against slavery in the Continental Congress. He had watched the compromises accumulate. He lived long enough to see the Missouri Crisis of 1820, which he called a title page to a great tragic volume, a warning that the unresolved question of slavery would eventually tear the country apart. He was right about that too. The real story of 1776 is not a story that ends in triumph on July 4th, with church bells ringing and the work done.
It is a story that begins there, with a declaration of principles that the nation has been arguing about, fighting over, and slowly, imperfectly, sometimes heroically trying to live up to ever since. And that, honestly, is a more interesting story, a more human story.
A more honest story. It is a story about what happens when people commit themselves to ideals they cannot fully live up to, and what those ideals then demand of the generations that follow. That is worth understanding. That is worth arguing about. That is worth celebrating. Not with comfortable myths, but with clear eyes and the willingness to ask hard questions. Because the real story of American independence is not behind us. In many ways, it is still being written. If this video gave you something to think about, a new angle on a story you thought you knew, that is exactly what this channel is here for. History is not a collection of settled facts and comfortable legends. It is a living argument, and the more honestly we engage with it, the better we understand where we are and how we got here. If you want to go deeper, the next video takes a close look at the Constitutional Convention of 1787, the moment when the founders had to figure out what independence actually meant in practice, and the compromises they made that would haunt the country for generations. It is a story of brilliant minds, sharp disagreements, and decisions made in a hot Philadelphia summer that still shape American life today. If you found this video valuable, consider subscribing so you do not miss it. And if you have a question, a pushback, or something you think I got wrong or left out, leave it in the comments. That kind of conversation is what makes this worth doing. See you in the next one. There is one more dimension of 1776 that rarely gets the attention it deserves, and it may be the most consequential of all. The question of what kind of revolution this actually was, compared to the other great revolutions that would follow it. The American Revolution stands at the beginning of what historians sometimes call the Age of Revolution, a period stretching roughly from 1776 to 1848, during which the political map of the Western world was remade by upheaval, independence movements, and the spread of Republican and democratic ideas. The French Revolution of 1789, the Haitian Revolution of 1791, the Latin American independence movements of the early 19th century, the European revolutions of 1848, all of these were connected, in complex ways, to what happened in Philadelphia in 1776. But the American Revolution was different from what came after it, and understanding how it was different tells you something important about why it succeeded where others failed, and what that success cost. The French Revolution, which drew so heavily on American example and American ideas, quickly became something the American founders watched with a mixture of admiration and horror. It began with declarations of rights and ended with the guillotine, the terror, and eventually Napoleon. It consumed its own leadership. It produced a decade of internal violence that dwarfed anything the American Revolution had generated. Why? One answer. The answer that conservative thinkers like Edmund Burke gave at the time, and that many historians have echoed since, is that the French Revolution tried to remake society from the ground up. It did not just change the political system, it attacked the church, the aristocracy, the entire social order, all at once. It was total in a way the American Revolution was not. The American Revolution, by contrast, was in many respects a conservative revolution, or at least a revolution that preserved as much as it changed. The colonists were not trying to create a new social order. They were, in their own self-understanding, defending an existing order against what they saw as British innovation and overreach. The institutions they created, the Congress, the presidency, the courts, the system of federalism, were built on English legal and political traditions that the colonists had inherited and adapted. Common law, habeas corpus, trial by jury, representative government. These were not invented in 1776. They were claimed, defended, and given new constitutional form. This conservative character of the American Revolution is both its strength and, in certain respects, its limitation. Its strength, it produced stable institutions that endured. The United States Constitution is the oldest written national constitution still in operation in the world. The basic framework of American government, with all its frustrating checks and balances, its slow and deliberate processes, its resistance to rapid change, has survived wars, economic crises, political upheavals, and the deaths of every person who created it. Its limitation, precisely because it was conservative, it preserved existing social hierarchies along with existing political traditions. It did not challenge property as a foundation of political rights. It did not challenge the economic system that made slavery profitable. It did not challenge the patriarchal structure of the family and of public life. It changed who held political power at the top, replacing a British imperial system with an American republican one, without fundamentally transforming the social relations at the bottom. The Haitian Revolution, which began in 1791 and resulted in the establishment of Haiti as the first black republic in the world in 1804, was a far more radical event. Enslaved people rose up against their French colonial masters, fought a brutal war against French, British, and Spanish forces, and created a new nation built on the principle that the universal rights proclaimed in both the American and French declarations actually applied to everyone, including people of African descent. The Haitian revolutionaries took the ideas of 1776 and 1789 more seriously than their authors had intended. The American response to the Haitian Revolution was largely one of fear. Southern slaveholders were terrified that the example of Haiti would inspire similar uprisings in the United States. The Jefferson administration, despite Jefferson's nominal commitment to liberty, refused to recognize Haiti diplomatically and imposed a trade embargo. The United States would not formally recognize Haitian independence until 1862, during the Civil War, after the slaveholding states had left the Union and could no longer block it. That fact alone tells you something profound about the limits of 1776's universalism. There is also a story to be told about the ordinary people of the Revolution. Not the founders whose faces appear on currency and whose words fill anthologies, but the farmers, artisans, sailors, and laborers who actually fought the war and whose motivations were often more immediate and more personal than grand philosophical principles. Many men joined the Continental Army not out of ideological conviction, but out of economic necessity. The army offered wages, food, clothing, and a bounty for enlistment, things that were genuinely attractive to men at the bottom of the colonial economic ladder. Studies of the composition of the Continental Army have found that it was disproportionately made up of young, poor, often landless men, exactly the people who had the least stake in the existing social order and the most to gain from the disruption of war. These men endured conditions that were, by any measure, appalling. The winter at Valley Forge in 1777 to 1778 is the most famous example. Nearly 2,000 soldiers died there, not in battle but from cold, disease, and malnutrition, while the Continental Congress struggled to supply them, and wealthy civilians a few miles away lived in relative comfort. Washington wrote letter after letter to Congress begging for supplies, food, shoes, and pay for his men. The response was often inadequate. The system of financing the war, relying on paper money that rapidly depreciated and on requisitions from states that were frequently ignored, was one of the Revolution's most serious failures. The men who survived Valley Forge and continued to fight were not doing so because they had read Locke or Paine. They were doing so because they had committed themselves to something, because their friends and comrades were doing it, because going home felt like betrayal, and because, in some cases, they genuinely believed they were fighting for something worth fighting for. The ideology of the Revolution reached down through the ranks in ways that were real, if less articulate than what you find in the pamphlets and the congressional debates. There is also the question of what the Revolution meant for the relationship between religion and public life, a question that was genuinely contested in 1776 and remains contested today. The founders were a religiously diverse group whose personal beliefs ranged from Orthodox Christianity to deism to something closer to skepticism. Washington spoke frequently of providence but rarely of Christ. Jefferson rewrote the Gospels, cutting out all the miracles and supernatural elements, leaving only the moral teachings. Franklin, at the Constitutional Convention, proposed opening each session with a prayer, a motion that was quietly tabled, partly because the delegates worried it would signal to the public that the convention was in crisis. The Constitution itself is a notably secular document. God is not mentioned in it. The only references to religion are prohibitions, no religious test for public office, and the First Amendment's guarantee that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting its free exercise. This was genuinely radical for its time. Most of the world's governments in 1787 were officially connected to a state religion. The American founders chose separation, for reasons that were both principled and practical. The colonies had too many different religious communities to establish any one of them without alienating the others. The relationship between the Revolution's secular political philosophy and the deeply religious character of much of the colonial population was, and remains, complex. The Great Awakening, the religious revival that had swept the colonies in the 1730s and 1740s, had created a culture of individual spiritual authority and resistance to established hierarchies that fed naturally into revolutionary politics.
Many of the most passionate patriots were also deeply religious people who understood their struggle in explicitly biblical terms as a fight for freedom against a new pharaoh.
The secular Enlightenment philosophy of the educated elite and the Protestant religious culture of ordinary colonists were not in conflict. They were, in the specific context of the revolution, surprisingly complementary. That combination, rational Enlightenment principles and Protestant moral energy, gave the American Revolution a particular character that distinguished it from the more aggressively secular French Revolution and helps explain some of its political durability. All of this brings us back to the central question: what should we actually think about 1776? The honest answer is that it deserves neither uncritical celebration nor cynical dismissal. Both of those responses are too easy, and both of them are historically inaccurate. The uncritical celebration ignores the slavery, the dispossession of indigenous peoples, the exclusion of women, and the gap between the founders' stated principles and their actual practice. It treats the founding as a completed achievement rather than an ongoing project. It mistakes the monument for the man, the symbol for the reality. The cynical dismissal makes the opposite error. It reduces the revolution to its hypocrisies and ignores its genuine achievements. It forgets that the ideals expressed in 1776, however imperfectly realized, were genuinely radical and genuinely consequential. It ignores the fact that the people who fought for civil rights in the 20th century, who fought for women's suffrage in the 19th, who fought for abolition before the Civil War, all of them drew on the language and the logic of the Declaration of Independence. The document's ideals were not merely a cover for elite interests. They were a weapon that could be, and was, turned against those elites by the people they excluded. The most honest position is something like this: 1776 was a genuine revolution that created genuine possibilities, carried out by people who were simultaneously visionary and limited, courageous and hypocritical, capable of extraordinary moral clarity and extraordinary moral blindness, often at the same time. The revolution they made was incomplete, deliberately, agonizingly incomplete in some ways, and the work of completing it has defined American history ever since. To understand that is not to diminish the founders. It is to take them seriously as human beings rather than as marble statues. And it is to take seriously the work that remains, the work of making the promise of 1776 real for everyone it was meant to include, and for everyone it should have included from the beginning. The bells that rang after the Declaration was read aloud in Philadelphia and New York and Boston in July 1776 were ringing for something that did not yet fully exist. They were ringing for a promise, a possibility, a bet on human capacity for self-governance and on the power of ideas to change the world. 2.5 centuries later, that bet is still being made. The argument that began in Philadelphia is still going on. And that perhaps is the most American thing of all, not the certainty of achievement, but the persistence of the argument, the refusal to let the gap between ideal and reality be the final word. That is 1776. Not a myth, not a lie, not a completed triumph, a beginning. If this video gave you a richer, more complicated picture of the American founding than you had before, that is exactly the goal. History is most valuable not when it confirms what we already believe, but when it challenges us to think more carefully, more honestly, and with more genuine curiosity about the people and events that shape the world we live in. There is a great deal more to explore here. If you want to go deeper into the Constitutional Convention, the compromises that built the American Republic, and the arguments that almost tore it apart before it began, that video is already on this channel and linked right now. And if you are new here, and this is the kind of history you have been looking for, clear, honest, and willing to ask hard questions, subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. Drop a comment below with the thing that surprised you most from this video. The conversation in the comments on these videos is genuinely one of the best parts of making them, and your questions often shape what gets covered next. See you there.